Tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. A seed planted today takes root and grows into a tree that bears fruit in the future. Over 110 years ago, a seed was planted. Today, that seed, the idea of excellence, has grown into the University of Pretoria, South Africa's largest contact research-intensive university. 9 faculties and a business school are spread across 7 beautiful campuses, which are home to over 50,000 students, ready to make an impact in the world beyond university and join our global network of nearly 300,000 alumni. Future-focused, sustainably developed facilities and cutting-edge multi- and transdisciplinary research are underpinned by a desire to transform lives and have a positive impact on communities and the world. Excellence in teaching, learning, research innovation, arts and culture, and sports puts us firmly amongst the world's best universities. Knowledge is not just what is in books. It is the wisdom to apply it, to nourish and nurture the seed so that it takes root, grows tall, bears fruit, and branches out. UP plants that seed, that tiny bit of curiosity, creativity, critical thinking, hope, the desire to care, respect, help, and innovate against all odds, to grow, to leave your mark, to excel, to challenge the norm, to think, to rethink, to discover, to inquire, to lead, to have courage, to make a difference, and to persevere. This is the University of Pretoria. We make today and every day matter.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is James Ogude, and I am the director of the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria. We are co-convening this webinar on coronavirus pandemic alongside with the Office of the Vice Chancellor. Let me start by welcoming you, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, Professor Tawana Kupe, our distinguished speakers who will be joining us in a series of sessions this morning, and also later on we'll have another session in the afternoon and the following day. I want to welcome you warmly to these important webinar deliberations. A warm welcome to you. Let me start by framing the subject of our talk today. And I want to start by giving a story. I come from a discipline of storytellers. I'm a literary scholar. So I want to frame this by using the story of a young South African artist called Ras Silas Motse. Ras Silas Motse recently won a special award for his work titled African Geometry Reborn, an attempt to reimagine ways of looking into the impact of coronavirus. And so this competition that brought together the sub-Saharan regional communities of Africa was won by this special young man. Now, what actually impressed me about the story of Ras was what he said in a recent interview. And he was trying to say that his idea in the art that he drew or painted was to capture the overlapping territories between science and the arts. Ras Silas stated that He has always been fascinated by the blurring lines between science and the arts. So when he entered this competition, his aim was to capture what he calls the geometry of coronavirus. Those of us who did some basic maths will understand that geometry is one of those aspects of maths that teaches us to think in more than one dimension, to think laterally, and to stretch our imagination. He refused, as he said, to focus on advocacy issues such as washing of hands, sanitizing, wearing of masks, social distancing, important as they may be. He was interested in the deeper narratives that this pandemic is likely to throw up. He was interested, for example, in violence against women and children that this pandemic compounded. He was interested in the geometry of economic and psychological deprivation, and also the fundamental fault lines of our society that this pandemic surfaced. He was interested in unmasking the face of the virus for what it is, its impact on the totality of the human ecology, and more. This story of Raz speaks to a range of issues that crossed our minds as we planned this webinar, issues to which these fine scholars gathered here today are likely to touch on. We felt that as a multidisciplinary center, we needed to unmask the face of COVID-19, to surface its character, and also to understand the science behind it. Things that have been masked sometimes by science itself, by scholarship itself. Things that we can learn from, lessons that we can draw from our experiences of the pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, I want us, in conclusion, as I invite the VC of the University of Pretoria to say some words. I won't say make a few remarks. I've learned over the years not to tell my bosses to make a few remarks. I'll ask him to welcome you formally and also to indicate to you that after the VC, Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, who is also the Deputy Director of the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship, will take over to moderate the first session of the webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, I hand you over to the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria, a strong supporter of this project, Professor Tawana Kupe. Over to you.
Thank you, Professor Ogudi, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whoever is listening. My understanding is that this webinar is being attended by people all around the world, and we live in different time zones. I'd like to thank Professor Ogudi and the colleagues at CAS for co-convening this webinar, which will provide us with 2 days of deep intellectual reflection at this very critical juncture. The if you like, and still, from the scientific point of view, not just a scientific crisis or a health crisis, but a crisis of, or a multidimensional crisis of everything that makes the world. It's a crisis of politics, a crisis of the economy, a crisis of society, a crisis of ecology and a crisis of the environment. And I think it calls for us actually to embark on very, very deep reflection. I'm therefore heartened and very thankful and grateful to the lineup of distinguished professors that are going to speak today and tomorrow. We're greatly honored that you can come, coming from multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, intellectual thinking and practices that you all come from to grace this occasion and illuminate what is a time of uncertainty, anxiety, fear, and bewilderment all across the world, which requires the kind of critical thinking that crosses and transcends traditional boundaries. As Professor Kude said, we should not be imprisoned, as the storyteller was, by disciplinary ways that do not speak to the fact that societal challenges do not come neatly packaged in academic disciplines. They require us to cross, transgress, and, if you like, uh, relate across those disciplinary boundaries and institutions and structures as we have known them. Only then can we, I think, in a sense, begin to illuminate those periods, like these periods, where the sustainability of the idea of being human, sustainability of humanity, sustainability of the environment, sustainability of the complementarity between humanity and the environment is under one of the greatest threats ever. I think in these 2 days, crossing disciplinary boundaries, going beyond the multidisciplinary into the transdisciplinary, is going to be what will provide the intellectual sustenance that the world needs at this point. I think it is very important also to add in this regard that we at the University of Pretoria were already on a trajectory to explore and navigate the transdisciplinary in understanding complex social and scientific phenomena that is interrelated, overlapping, and also very complicated, with a view to finding whether we could find both intellectual solutions, if one might use that word, but also practical real world solutions to create a much better, more sustainable world and to ensure the sustainability of humanity and the complementarity between humanity and the environment. In this regard, the pandemic has given us an opportunity, and the webinar falls in that context, to begin to reimagine the role of the University of Pretoria and indeed higher education in South Africa, higher education globally, in the very necessary and urgent process of not just reimagining a better world, but making a contribution to creating a better world than the crisis ridden one that we live in today, that can be so easily paralyzed by a virus. It is also a moment of awakening, I think, for the rest of the world and humanity, that indeed our frailty and our fragility is ever so present. But it is in our hands if we rethink and we take different directions that are more ethical, that are more just, if you like, and that are more sustaining of humanity and the environment. And that intellectual ideas, centers like this, scholars like the ones that we present to us today, are vitally important in that regard. The University of Pretoria will continue to provide such platforms. We have created also new transdisciplinary research platforms, the Future Institute and the campus, Engineering 4.0, the Javed UP Art Center for the Arts of Africa, and now another called UP. Sustain precision and all new resources like this wish to make I contribute to create a world that is more just and more. We again thank the scholars and the center. Wish you all very deep reflections and also and directions that might well that tend to. So thank you again, Professor.
Thank you, Professor Tawana Kupe, for that wonderful welcome and for your remarks. Now I want to hand over to Professor Tinyiko Maluleke, who is going to chair the next session. Professor Tinyiko Maluleke needs no introduction. Is one of our leading scholars of Black theology, on the continent, and also currently the Deputy Director of the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship. He is responsible for seminars at our center and has been at the core of the organization of this seminar. Welcome, Professor Tinyiko.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Ogude, for introducing me. I am delighted to be the facilitator of this first session of our webinar. We are very fortunate to have in this session 4 of the most accomplished scholars in their fields globally, and I want to briefly introduce the 4 speakers. Professor Howard Phillips is an emeritus professor in the Historical Studies Department of the University of Cape Town. He specializes in 2 areas: the social history of medicine, focusing especially on epidemics and pandemics, medical education and hospitals, and the history of universities also. Then we have Professor Peter Veil, who is a senior research fellow at our center, the Center for the Advancement of Scholarship here at the University of Pretoria. He is also the Emeritus Nelson Mandela Professor of Politics at Rhodes University. His research interests include, amongst others, social thought, intellectual traditions in South Africa, and the origins of international relations in South Africa. Then we have Professor Veronique Tajo, who is a celebrated writer, a distinguished academic, an artist, and a scholar of note. She hails from Côte d'Ivoire. She is currently a visiting professor at the University of Witwatersrand. And finally, we have Professor Francis Nyamjo, who is a professor of social anthropology at the University of Cape Town. Before joining this university, he worked at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa in Dakar, Senegal. Professor Nyamjo has researched and written extensively on globalization, mobility, citizenship, and belonging. Each in their own way, our 4 distinguished speakers will explore how the COVID-19 pandemic is rekindling and reshaping and disrupting conventional discourses about public health in Africa and in the world. At the same time, they will explore how COVID-19 seems to have laid bare our primal fears about human vulnerability, human endurance, human resilience in the face of natural disasters, as well as the human aptitude to learn or not to learn from history. And so I invite Professor Howard Phillips to be our first speaker. Over to you, Professor Phillips.
Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for the introduction, though I'm afraid I could hear absolutely nothing, so I hope you can hear what I'm saying. The fundamental point that I want to make is that pandemics are nothing new in South Africa. South Africa has a very long history of exposure to pandemics and epidemics. And it's really to draw on this long history that I want to be able to put into wider perspective the human response to pandemics, which have characterized the way in which societies have responded both in the past and right to the present. And in that way, really try and give us a way of understanding COVID-19 in the light of previous experience of pandemics. If I look back at South African history, I can identify at least 5 major pandemics which have struck the subcontinent. Smallpox in the 18th and 19th century, bubonic plague at the beginning of the 20th century, the great devastating Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1919, the polio epidemics of the 1940s and 1950s, and HIV/AIDS since the 1980s. And if I look back over all of these pandemics and the way in which South African society responded, I'm struck by a number of continuities, a number of similarities, which make it very clear that there's an underlying pattern of human response to epidemics. And indeed, this is not peculiar to South Africa or Africa. This is almost a standard human response to pandemics. We can go back into ancient times, we can go back into more recent times, and we can see the same pattern, these same responses. First of all, I want to just pull these out and identify them, and then talk about how each of these 5 pandemics in South Africa's history illustrate at least one or other of these characteristics which are so common. So first of all, let me flag what I would regard as perhaps the 5 significant effects which pandemics have had. Firstly, pandemics reveal the underpinnings of society. They give a clear indication of what's happening below the surface of society. I can draw an example from the writings of the 3rd century AD, St. Cyprian, the Bishop of Carthage, writing in the midst of a devastating pandemic, wrote, "Pestilence and plague, search out the righteousness of each and every one and examine the minds of the human race." So one of the very distinctive features, one of the very common effects of pandemics, epidemics, is that they lay bare the underpinnings of society. They reveal things which are there, but in a sense have almost been taken for granted, and they show them up in a very sharp light indeed. There's a very nice parallel. It's almost like applying an X-ray to a situation, and you see what's happening below the surface. So that's one very common feature, common effect of pandemics, this revelation. The second of the 5 which I can identify from past epidemics is, in a sense, almost a subset of this, is that pandemics reveal underlying attitudes to others, attitudes to those around us who might be regarded as different in some ways. And one of the consequences of this is that very commonly this produces what one might say is finger pointing. Who's to blame? Who's responsible for this devastating epidemic? And this is a very standard human response. And from it flows very often and very sadly stigmatization, wanting to be able to say so-and-so is to blame, this group or this a component of society or this nation. And this is a second very common feature of pandemics, the finger pointing, the idea that we must be able to identify someone or something who is responsible and perhaps to take action against them. So that's the second way in which epidemics characteristically evoke responses. A third effect of epidemics is that they tend to escalate patterns and trends which are perhaps already taking place, but very slowly within a society. They accelerate forces which are there and produce a sudden implementation. So very commonly, the nature of epidemics is to speed up processes or forces which are already in a society, but which don't actually yet manifest themselves. What an epidemic does, what pandemics do, is to really give these a force and an ability to be implemented and acted upon, which previously one might not have thought would have happened for a very long time. So that's the third way in which we can see epidemics and pandemics having a significant and similar effect in all times, in all places. The fourth of the five effects and consequences which pandemics, serious epidemics have, is that they sometimes introduce entirely novel and entirely unexpected features into society. In a sense, they initiate things which you would not have anticipated. They bring about situations which could not easily be foreseen. And that too is a very common characteristic of pandemics. And then finally, the fifth of the ways in which we can recognize patterns which epidemics, pandemics, global pandemics produce is that they trigger a wish for reform. Most obviously, reform of health and public health issues, but not exclusively. They could trigger reforms of social nature, of medical nature, of societal nature. They produce that kind of crisis which pushes politicians, statespeople to say, right, now we need to act. We need to introduce some kind of reform. So these are five of the most significant consequences, effects, which epidemics and serious epidemics and pandemics produce. What I want to do now, and hopefully there will be some slides available to just illustrate, is to take examples from each of these five major pandemics which have struck South Africa and pinpoint one or other of these features which they reflect, which they show up. So the first example I want to draw, yes, there's the slide. The first example I want to draw is from the devastating smallpox epidemics which hit the subcontinent from the beginning of the 18th century through until the end of the 19th century. In particular, what I want to do is the way in which, entirely unanticipated, these smallpox epidemics, and can we have that slide up again, that same slide, please? Thank you. Completely devastated the indigenous Khoikhoi population. Here's a contemporary sketch of a Khoikhoi funeral right at the beginning of this devastating smallpox pandemic. The Khoikhoi had no previous exposure to smallpox. It is what epidemiologists call a virgin soil epidemic, and it absolutely devastated the Khoikhoi population. It decimated their numbers. It reduced them from an independent set of communities, societies, moving around the Southwestern Cape in particular, reduced them to a servile status, much, much reduced in numbers. In fact, one of the consequences of smallpox is that if you contract smallpox and survive, you were left infertile, which meant that the Khoikhoi population could not reproduce themselves. And consequently, here, out of left field, entirely unanticipated, was a devastation, a decimation of the Khoikhoi population repeatedly in 1713, in 1755, in 1767, in 1812, in 1840. There are 8 or 9 of these sweeping smallpox epidemics, which literally transformed the demographics of the subcontinent. So here's an example of how a pandemic, out of the blue, initiated a completely new situation and pretty well transformed the demography of the subcontinent. The second example I want to draw is from the bubonic plague epidemic at the beginning of the 20th century. Bubonic plague, part of a worldwide pandemic starting in China, hit particularly Cape Town and then eventually Johannesburg. And what this did, and what this slide illustrates, is the way in which people were scapegoated. People who were regarded as other, a minority, were identified as they are responsible. And what this permitted was for the authorities to do something which they had talked about and discussed for some years, but had not been able to implement. What they did was to say, who's responsible for this outbreak of bubonic plague? And the fingers were turned onto the stevedores at the harbour in Cape Town, where the epidemic had been introduced. And the stevedores were Black Africans, those who were beginning to migrate to Cape Town from the second half of the 19th century. They were regarded as a minority, as other, as not part of us, and consequently fingers were pointed at them. And already before the plague hit Cape Town, there was talk that they should be moved out of central Cape Town. They should be racially segregated. However, this remained talk until the plague hit. And when the plague hit, immediately fingers pointed. They are responsible. And what that slide, can we have that slide up again, please? What that slide shows is the Africans from District 6 being forcibly removed. You can see troops marching alongside them, being forcibly removed from District 6 to a plague camp, it was called, on the Cape Flats, which eventually became Ndabeni. So here you can see these two features of what epidemics do very much in force in Cape Town at the beginning of the 20th century. A minority identified, scapegoated, and then action taken, action which previously had not really been possible, but under the fear, under the threat of death as a result of epidemics, action was taken. And that's the beginning of residential segregation of Africans in Cape Town and subsequently in Southern Africa. Perhaps even more dramatic is what happened when bubonic plague moved into the interior and hit Johannesburg, because it hit Johannesburg at a point when Johannesburg was under new British administration in 1904. And what this did was to have the British authorities turn on Johannesburg, and particularly on an area, a rather rundown slum area then called Coolie Location, where the population was racially mixed, African, Indian, and coloured. And this, to the British authorities, was for some years already regarded as something which was unacceptable, that they should be living right in the centre of Johannesburg. When the bubonic plague hit in 1904, immediately the authorities acted and said, we must remove this plague spot. Can we have the next slide up, please? And what they did, and this dramatic photograph shows, is quite literally they razed to the ground Coolie Location. They set it on fire and forcibly removed the entire population to a sewage farm about 12 miles west of Johannesburg. And at this resettlement, Indians, Africans, and coloureds were settled in separate areas alongside each other. What is telling is that what the plague permitted was for the forced removal of this Coolie Location population. And indeed, the long-term consequences of this are very significant, because out at this plague farm called Klipspruit, west of Johannesburg, after the plague had passed, Indians and coloureds were allowed to return to Johannesburg, but not Africans. Africans were told, henceforth, this is where you will stay. And this became the heart of the African residential component of the population of Johannesburg. The significance is that Klipspruit in the 1930s became known as Pimville, And in the 1950s, Pimville became the core of Soweto. So Soweto's location today actually goes back to the forced removal of Africans in 1904. So here's an example, again, of stigmatization and an opportunity to put into practice something which previously had been talked about, but not actually, there was no opportunity to implement it. The third example of the way in which pandemics produce a response is over the Spanish flu of 1918-1919. Absolutely devastating. 300,000 people dead in 6 weeks, probably 5 or 6% of the total population. One of the consequences is that it opened the eyes of, and here you see this feature of epidemics, they reveal what's already apparent, but no one really has taken much notice of. They reveal, the Spanish flu revealed the slum conditions in which many whites lived in Cape Town in particular, in this example. And one of the consequences was to say, as a result of what we have seen, what has been revealed in the Spanish flu, we need to make better provision for housing for whites. And at the initiative of a wealthy benefactor, money was set aside together with support from the Union government to create, next slide please, to create the first garden city, a well laid out, very, very healthy, salubrious suburb for Cape Town called Pinelands. And this is the stone which marks the establishment of Pinelands as one of these opportunities, one of these attempts to remedy the poor housing conditions for particularly for working class whites, for lower middle class whites. And so here's an example of how a pandemic can trigger a health response, in this case, a housing response, because the revelation of the epidemic has been such as to promote and produce action. Interestingly, and again tellingly in terms of long consequences, the Union government, in response to the Spanish flu, passed the first Housing Act in 1920 to provide central government funding for housing for the population because of the way in which the Spanish flu had revealed the very poor housing conditions in the country. The fourth epidemic that I want to refer to, which reveals some of these features of what epidemics do, is the polio epidemic of the 1940s and 1950s. Polio is an unusual disease in that, for immunological and public health reasons, it tended mostly to attack whites, particularly young whites, the coming generation. And in early apartheid South Africa, this was a source of immense fear, of immense panic in government circles. And consequently, though polio really affected only a relatively small part of the population, that part of the population which was affected was that which had political clout, white individuals, and consequently enormous mobilization of resources against polio. Next slide, please. Here you can see Durban's Addington Hospital with the iron lungs, the state-of-the-art technology to deal with cases of polio laid out. So no expense was spared to deal with the outbreak of polio, particularly amongst whites. And what this does, again, is lay bare the underpinnings, in this case, the power underpinnings of the society. In many ways, what you can see here is the result of a constructed epidemic, the way in which an outbreak was turned into a major, major source of fear, prompting immense government action. There was a huge public appeal for funds, which produced just from the public something of what today would be the equivalent of perhaps 300 million rand for a polio research foundation. And here's an example of how epidemics lay bare, in this case, the power underpinnings of society. And then finally, to come to slightly more recent times, HIV/AIDS, beginning in the 1980s, immediately, because of the nature of the disease and the way in which it was primarily transmitted, produced finger pointing. Who's to blame? Who's responsible? And those who are responsible must in some way be identified and dealt with. And here, poignantly, dramatically, we see one of the consequences of stigmatization. A poster recalling what happened to an HIV positive woman in KwaMashu in Durban, Gugu Dlamini, who went public, who appeared on talk radio and talked about her condition. And this so angered, so alienated, so antagonized those in her neighborhood that they attacked her, as this says, and beat her, and eventually she died of this attack. So here's an example, again, of the way in which epidemics lay bare attitudes which, to the other, to those who are identified as responsible, and consequently they are, in this case, forcibly removed from society and killed. So here are 5 examples of the ways in which serious epidemics, pandemics, produce effects which are often very long-lasting indeed. And the significance for us now in the midst of COVID-19 is that the epidemics are not absolutely duplicates of each other. They vary, but by and large, there are similarities. And if we are aware of these similarities, the 5 which I've labeled here, revelation about the underpinnings of society, revelation about attitudes to other, the way in which they speed up forces or trends which are already imminent in a society, the way in which they introduce new features, and finally the way in which they trigger responses. Then we should be, in looking at COVID-19, recognize these features and say, here are yet further examples of this standard human response. Epidemics are not without significant precedents, and what we need to do if we want to handle COVID-19 and any future epidemics is understand the ways in which human societies respond and anticipate them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much, Prof, for that illuminating presentation. We move on immediately, I think, to the next presentation, because we'll have our discussion right at the end of all the 4 presentations, as I understand it. So, Professor Peter Vale.
Thank you very much. I want to try to do 4 things. I want to say thank you in a particular kind of way. I want to make a personal remark, and then I want to spend some time musing about these COVID times with the eye to opening a few boxes, philosophical boxes, which are really about the philosophy of science. I want to thank you to the Vice-Chancellor for his leadership of the university at this difficult time. People keeping universities together is normally difficult, and at this time it's particularly so. I want to thank the director of the CAS for organizing this and his colleagues. I want to thank you, Professor Maluleka. You and I call each other My China. I want to thank My China for being involved in this. But particularly, I want to thank those who set up this project and those who will clean up after us. This is a particular kind of way of saying thank you, because I think one of the great things to come out of the last 6 or 10 months of scholarship is Michael Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit. And I think what we are dealing with here is the understanding that there are limits to knowledge, and that we have to recognize those who do mundane work are often the most important people in our society. So I think we should always, in academic work, thank those who do the most mundane work. And I recommend very highly that we study and think about Michael Sandel's book. In the personal remark, I want to remember today my friend Martin de Wit, who was one of this country's most interesting scholars, a friend of 40 years, who was always imaginative, curious, provocative, and feisty about science matters. He would have loved today's conversation. He would have loved the idea that we were getting together to have a robust argument about the place of science and humanity together, exploring interdisciplinary ideas. And so to muse about these COVID times. COVID-19 has changed everything because it has changed the everyday. Everything looks the same, but we know everything is vastly different. And I think that creates particular problems for our perception, our cognitive perception of how we deal with our daily lives and our professional lives. For those of us who are interested in social theory, COVID-19 is the most instructive thing ever in the field of social theory. It's an ongoing social experiment. We're in the middle of theorizing and living and practicing and trying to understand the social and its place and how we think about the social. And I got this idea from a really interesting essay written by Oxford's Simon Margison, and I'm going to come back to this, and I hope that there will be space to put up some of the references which we have used in the course of today. COVID-19 has destroyed the myth of globalization and amplified the mundane. And I think this is particularly true in the case of universities. I mean, we were celebrating, and we discussed this slightly earlier before the event started. We were celebrating the fact that academics were free to travel across the world, and this was the globalized form of knowledge. And we lived within this global bubble of universities. And I think COVID-19 has changed that fundamentally. We're going to have to rethink the university as much as we rethink knowledge. And what we're doing today is part of that rethink. This is because COVID-19 has stripped us of our global citizenship, making us burghers, making us citizens of the blocks in which we live. And I think there are profound things at work here in terms of the administrative units within society is organized. I think states are under threat in a fundamental notion. The idea of states are under threat in a way that we've never experienced before, in a way actually more profound than in globalization. But at the same time, states are accruing power to themselves like never before. But if you think about what happened in the last 3 days, I mean, there's a section of England in Manchester who are trying to draw away in profound ways from England. So this is a breakup not only of the United Kingdom, but of trying to reorganize England, a tiny state, in a particular kind of way. So our notion of the stability of categories and administrative units are profoundly threatened. In a sense, COVID-19 has made us all immigrants. We've left one place and we are transiting to another place. And we have no understanding where this other place is. And this conversation is part of that attempt to understand the place we're going. And we also don't know what the visa will be to take us between one place and the other. Is it economics? Is it the recovery of the economy? Is it the discovery of a vaccine? We have no idea because the visa question is left entirely unresolved, and scholars and thinkers are working on the question of visa. We are living in science fiction instead of reading it. Now, I know that Professor Ogudi has recently been reading Camus' The Plague, but throughout this whole period, I've been thinking about a book I read as a child called On the Beach by the Australian writer Neville Shute. I think Australian-British writer. It's a story about from the mid 1950s about the world being subject to a nuclear blast in the global north and what people in the global south think about it. This optic that you have on a part of the world which you don't understand. And I think this profoundly upsets our sense of what is real and what is fictional. And what is going to be really interesting is to read the novels that come out of this COVID period and to read them in different ways. We may all live in different centuries, as Karl Polanyi and Arundhati Roy say. We live in different centuries at the same time. But I think COVID-19 has plunged us into a single time frame. And this single time frame in which we living provides a great challenge for science. Can we frame this time frame in which we're living? Can science, can philosophy, can the philosophy of science, can literature frame this time frame? Can it help define this place where we are all migrants? So my friends, has there ever been a greater challenge on that bridge between science and society? And indeed, this is the basis of this conversation and the conversation which we'll have in the next 2 days. Part of this begins, I think, with the idea of crisis. What is a crisis and how do we understand a crisis? I think COVID is teaching us that crisis is a struggle for a vocabulary. So much has been written and spoken about crisis, but so little about COVID, but so little understood about it. And we come to this question of the crisis without any help, as Hannah Arendt famously remarked, without any banisters to rely on. Our categories, as I've said, the way we think about things have changed in a profound way. What is also interesting as we come to this issue is which language should we use to understand it? Whose language will lead us through this? And this question of language, I think, has been largely unexamined before COVID, during COVID, and will continue to be unexamined after COVID unless we are alive to it. So we speak in English, and the major language of the academic and science world is English. But as our own Neville Alexander reminded us, English is not a neutral language. And I think we're going to have to try to understand each other by something different than simply English. This doesn't mean we must go for a global language. It means we must be conscious of all languages and all the subtleties implied in language. This is almost a Wittgensteinian problem. Some scientists will indicate to us that our way through this is with statistics. But if, following Neville Alexander, we'll know that statistics themselves are not neutral. Will the language we use to try and understand where we're going, and indeed the methods we use to try and understand where we're going, artificial intelligence? I myself doubt it, although many people in the academic community and elsewhere are pushing the idea of artificial intelligence and the fourth industrial revolution. I want to stick with crisis just for a little bit. Recent crises have been easily dissolved by slogans. Let me give you an example. Take 9/11. 9/11 was dissolved. The crisis around 9/11 was immediately dissolved by two phrases: a war on terror or a coalition of the willing. During the Cold War, the crisis was dissolved by a simple binary understanding of East versus West. But in this particular crisis, slogans won't do it. We need something much more than simple slogans. If we're going to have a policy, if we're going to be able to manage this, we will need more than simple slogans. And it's interesting that quite a lot of the American election has been driven by slogans, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Recent crises have also been largely spectacles. Take the Twin Tower for an example. What an unbelievable spectacle. But the crises of migration have also been, global migration, have also been marked by spectacles. And who can forget that tragic spectacle of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned on a Turkish beach? COVID has no spectacle. And even if we live with that little cartoon of the COVID virus, there is no spectacle. And the absence of spectacle makes it, I think, very difficult for us to try and understand what is going on. This does not mean that COVID has no theatrics. COVID has shown an enormous amount of theatrics. Trump, for example, is the dangerous clown of this COVID crisis, and the prop which is being used in this charade. But mask is one of the theatrics which is used throughout the COVID crisis. And this brings us towards both politics and the role of science. It is helpful to cut the year up into 2 phases, the initial and the latter. The initial period, which was the lockdown, was driven by state-sanctioned action, which was driven and appreciated by the logic of science. This was a moment when 2 things came together: coincidence of science in a Venn diagram, coincidence of science and the political came together to manage this, not perfectly, but quite substantially. And that certainly brought the curve down. And this was sparked essentially by fear. But fear has done many different things. I want to talk about this initial period because I think different societies approach the coincidence of science and technology, science and political management in different ways. And I want to use a cultural difference here. The Germans and the Nordics modified the very powerful individualism in their own societies in the interests of community. I want to say that again. North Europeans modified the individualism in society in the bedding, embedded this in the idea of community. The British and the US were driven by fierce individualism first, and then by community. I think this is a thing we have to think about, and it brings us back to language. I think there is something in the English language which brings this fierce individualism and absence of community to the fore. And that's why, as I've suggested, we need to think about these issues in different languages. In the way we organize society needs to escape from the tyranny of the English language, which presents it in a certain very fierce managerial and top-down manner. The latter phase of the crisis, the last months, August, September, October, have been characterized by a fight back in the name of freedom. This fight back has many manifestations, most powerfully in the United States, but also within the UK, and interestingly, also in the Netherlands. And in this fight back, the state is assumed to have no authority, no rights over the individual. And this is where state and society begin to part company in fundamental ways. Who owns the state? Whose word matters in the context of the state? Here is the place that the role of science is at the core of the issue. What are the claims of science superior to the claims of politics? Which matters most for the migrants that we are? This dilemma, Mr. Chairman, has echoes in a very famous poet, which got me into a conflict with poem, which got me into a conflict with my mother in 1963. This is Yevgeny Yevgestenko's famous poem, The City of Yes and the City of No. One city representing tyranny, one city representing a perfect world. In the sense, looking at it now, the city of no would be the city of individualism, and the city of yes would be the city of community. And I want to quote to you from Yevgestenka's poem. I'm like a train rushing for many years now between the city of yes and the city of no. My nerves are strained like wires between the city of no and the city of yes. And why my mother objected to me reading this poem by this Russian poet was because she said she didn't want to become a communist, didn't want me to become a communist. And I think this little interesting insight into my own personal experience and this relationship I had with my mother is really how ignorance plays fundamentally into these issues. Slogans play fundamentally into determining how we believe things to be. This brings us to another bridge. And this is the most important bridge that we have to walk away from this COVID thing. It's the proverbial no man's land between the natural world and modernity. And this is the biggest issue we face. The pandemic is the canary in the proverbial coal mine for humankind, because it is what Bruno Latour, the sociologist, the French sociologist and philosopher, calls a rehearsal for climate change. What COVID-19 has shown is that science has to prove that health and community is a collective responsibility, and that the public domain matters more than the individual one. This is not going to be easy, because the long tail of the economic swishes all the time, the long tail arguing that we have to have economic growth, that long tail which is still to produce in its most perfect form the Christian economist. This will not be an easy journey as we're experiencing, trying to understand, convert our lessons from COVID into the climate experience. It is a social experiment that we have to be on. It is a social experience that we have to be on top of, not only in terms of policy, not only in terms of the disciplines, but in terms of social thought. And it must all begin with imagination. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, my China, as you reminded me. I think we want to move straight ahead because we don't want to lose time and go straight to the next speaker, who is Professor Veronique Tajo. Over to you, Prof.
Hello. Hi to everybody. I want to thank Vice Chancellor Professor Tawana Coupe and also Prof. James Ogude for inviting me to this virtual seminar. I will be a very obedient participant, and I will try to reply to the questions asked. So I will start with vulnerability and uncertainty. I think that we have two certainty which are our birth and our death. And in between this period that separate them, it's just about uncertainties. And we must, in fact, expect the unexpected all the time. The best scenarios don't always work, and we cannot control our life. At the personal level, accidents and ill health can happen at any time. At the national and global level, conflicts, natural disasters, and epidemics can occur. For Albert Camus, we have the French Algerian writer who has already been mentioned earlier. This is the absurdity of the human condition. Our undertakings rest on chance. In fact, instead of trying to instead of ignore this level of uncertainty, we need to factor in uncertainty as an inherent part of our life. If with the pandemic, science now occupies center stage, it has also shown a surprising level of uncertainty. Yet, for generations, science has been viewed as based on absolute truths. But what happened? We can see today that scientists do not necessarily agree with one another on major issues, like the origin of the virus, for example, the best type of health restrictions to implement, the effectiveness of masks, or the treatment options, or even clinical trials. We have realized now that science is extremely important, but it doesn't have the answer to all the questions. In fact, research strives on controversy, as it allows the scientific community to test, evaluate, approve, or sometimes dismiss outright certain theories or studies. So we understand that the history of science is one of trials and errors. There is also a great amount of uncertainty regarding the long-term social, economic, educational, and psychological consequences of the pandemic. Therefore, we must go back to a more holistic view of knowledge, or precisely of knowledge, include knowledges with an S, including, of course, traditional medicine. We must also take into account behavioral and cultural aspects, which both play an enormous role during epidemics. Very often, individual moral responsibility is at the heart of our choices. I talked about masks, the less of mask. It's a good example. You wear a mask not so much to protect yourself, but to protect others. And others wear masks to protect you. But even that is debatable, in the sense that at one point we thought that masks were not a protection, a personal protection. But now this has evolved, and it is both agreed that they give a protection to the bearer and to other people. So it's constant debate. All over the world, what is striking is that we have seen ordinary people doing extraordinary things. People you might not even have given a second look in the streets have been braver than many highly visible personalities. It is the case of most key workers who come from backgrounds where uncertainty and vulnerability are part of their life. Because of their first-hand experience of suffering, they are better equipped to rise to the challenges that come our way. They become actively engaged instead of being helplessly resigned in the face of what appears like an unstoppable viral plague. Now, what lessons can be learned from the history of plagues and epidemics? I will concentrate on the recent epidemic of the Ebola crisis in 2014, which took place in West Africa, namely in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. When the Ebola epidemic struck, the health infrastructures in these three countries were already broken or insufficient. And I can list some of the broken parts. Lack of well-equipped hospitals, inadequate drugs, insufficient qualified medical staff, and the list goes on. As a consequence, most people were suspicious of their national health. That was even before the epidemic started. For them, Western medicine and its remedies was a failure. They associated hospitals with a death warrant. So when the epidemic started, mobilizing people and convincing them to go to Ebola treatment centers, for example, became a major challenge. The lack of trust made the fight for Ebola much more difficult than it could have been. Another very negative factor was the mistrust in the political leadership. For example, we know that Liberia and Sierra Leone were just slowly emerging from devastating wars. As for Guinea, it had been living under a long dictatorship. So when you look at all these elements, it was the perfect storm. The devastation that ensued was of biblical proportion. The center caved in, and untold suffering and chaos took place. Of course, when I say that, I'm aware that, and everybody is aware that it wasn't like that everywhere and at the same time. Sometimes, for example, I would call Guinea to find out about how some of my friends were doing during the Ebola crisis. And in Conakry, the capital, people seem to be able to go about their normal daily activities. And it was mainly in the rural areas that the epidemic was fierce. Nevertheless, we cannot deny that these countries, these three countries, were on the verge of tipping over had it not been for the massive intervention of foreign countries that came to the help of these countries. And I can quickly give a short list. The United States, Great Britain, France, Canada, but also Cuba, South Africa, India, and China, among other countries. During the whole Ebola epidemic, one thing was striking. It was the fact that a lot of women suffered in a particularly hard way because of the common perception of women as caregivers. They're very often, even on a normal basis, in charge of the young, of the old, and of the sick. So women were struck in a very particular way during the Ebola crisis, and this is something that we have to remember when we learn the lessons from the COVID period that we're living in. There was a moment in the fight against the Ebola virus when, despite all the international and national efforts, a vast amount of money, aid money, that was pumped in, the disease was not backing off. So the scientists, the anthropologists, the strategists started to think hard on their feet. And the answer that they finally came with was absolutely amazing in its simplicity. The answer was in the people themselves, the populations, in the sense that the virus would not be defeated without the full cooperation. And I think from what has been said before, it is clear that the cooperation of the population themselves is one of the key elements of the success in containing an epidemic or a pandemic. The individual versus the community. When the Ebola epidemic was officially ended in West Africa in 2016, there was a sigh of relief all over the world. Ebola could have become a pandemic, but it just stopped short of becoming a pandemic. Then, after the sun and the fury, came silence. It seemed that everybody had forgotten about this traumatic period. Even in Africa, it appeared that people wanted to turn the page as fast as possible. Now, from being an academic, I'm also a writer and an artist. For me, memory is the best medicine against recurrent disasters. I believe that West Africans and Africans in general have not been through a debriefing process regarding the Ebola crisis. They have not really taken in the traumatic impact of what happened in 2014. Yet the suffering has left deep scars in people's minds, and we should have addressed it in a stronger way. That's just my intuition. And so I thought that maybe literature could be one way of addressing this issue, at least at the cultural level. So I got down to write, and I was faced with the one of the challenges, which was how do you talk about something so vast, so big, so with such an impact that had such an impact on so many people, and how do you make it relevant on a personal, on an individual level? So I decided to weave facts, songs, legends, poems, fictionalized testimonies, documentary prose, and oral tradition to try to voice the despair, dedication, hope, and solidarity that took hold of so many Africans during these terrible months. So in my book with the title of In the Company of Men, which was first written in French in 2017 and which is now coming out in February 2021 when it will be published by Overpress. I tried also to show that epidemics do not come with a fixed nationality. Ebola, and that was one of the big problems, was categorized as an African problem, emerging from the dark heart of the continent. It stayed with us, and that was one of the traumatic consequences of the epidemic. So for me, it was important to show that, on the contrary, this epidemic questioned our humanity as a whole. And also, one thing that I learned while researching on the subject of what had happened during the Ebola crisis is that everything was connected. And it sounds obvious today, but it took a while for it to dawn on me that the devastation, the plantation system, our economic choices, and the degradation of the environment all converged to make the epidemic happen in a way both unpredictable and predictable. Today, with COVID-19, we see that viruses know no border. Although the disease first struck in China, it has spread all over the world. I mean, Trump was very quick at the beginning of the epidemic to say that it was a Chinese virus. But today, this just simply does not hold, as we very well know. But for the African continent, I think that Ebola was a turning point. Africa learned some very important health lessons. One can say that it has helped the continent today to be better prepared to face the coronavirus pandemic. For example, the numbers of contaminations and deaths are low compared with what is happening in the West. Of course, when I say that, I realize that almost 50% of the contamination and deaths on the African continent are in South Africa and in the north of Africa. So yet again, when we talk about this pandemic, there are differences, strong differences here and there. Unfortunately, if we take the case of West Africa, it seems that although it is relatively untouched at the moment, the economic impact may prove to be the hardest part of it all this time. And we already are feeling the economic impact of the pandemic with a disruption, economic disruption, in all sectors due to the fact that Africa remains very dependent to external economic links, and therefore food and importations are extremely disrupted. One thing that is striking is that although Africa learned some lessons, in West Africa we still the improvement of the health system is still an important factor. It has not really happened, and there is still a lot to be done on that level. One crucial consideration is also to rebuild the trust between leaders and society. And it seems that it's almost a problem all over the world. It seems that the world is on edge, and that the trust in leadership is causing deep-seated trouble. Look at what is happening today in Nigeria, for example, as we speak, and there have been big riots by young people, demonstrations by young people who want a better form of government, who are protesting against police violence. And this is something that we must be very aware of. There's going to be and more social trouble, in the sense that in order to face the big challenges, the nations need to be in tune with their governments. But everywhere we see that, not everywhere, but in a lot of countries, we see that there are clashes between the authorities and the population. I see, for example, at the moment in Guinea, there are clashes between the outgoing government and the opposition regarding the third term mandate. It doesn't seem that, I will explain, is that Alpha Condé, who is the president of Guinea, the outgoing president of Guinea, has wants to start a third mandate, which is unconstitutional. So we have here a clash, and this is the same that is happening in Ivory Coast. The problem is that in this time of high tension brought about by the sanitary, by the situation, by the health situation, we really need the cooperation of everybody. We really need the energies to come together. I think that in this sense, we can see that there is a period of discontentment, a period of rebellion in terms of the link between authoritarian power and society. This is one of the lessons that we must learn, is that we must come together as a more in a more united front, because the epidemic, the pandemic, is challenging a lot of authorities. The coronavirus has shown us in a painful way that humanity is a single organism, and that human existence is possible only in relation to other living beings. So we're going to see that we'll have to look at our society, we'll have to look at inequalities that are coming up to the fore, and we'll have to try and have societies that are more inclusive, because I think that tolerance is something that is not going to be there for long if these divisions in society continue to be that strong. That's what I have to say.
Merci beaucoup, Professor. Thank you very much. I now invite our last speaker, Professor Francis Nyamjo. Over to you.
It's good to be last. Very little to say after listening to my colleagues, but perhaps just to reiterate a few points. First, to thank the Vice Chancellor, Professor Coupe, and James Ogude for organizing this webinar and making me part of it. I have entered the conversation from the with the focus of trying to examine resilience, both at the level of how people afflicted by a pandemic like COVID-19 are trying to cope, are trying to fight it, are mobilizing their energies to ensure that it doesn't have the last laugh. And at the same time, what COVID-19 tells us about systemic structures and their resilience. First, it's been mentioned both by Howard and I think by Peter Vell that what COVID tends to reveal, or what it opens our eyes to. And in my reflections, I think it opens our eyes, or it has opened our eyes to five areas of debate, which I would like to throw in as we carry forward our thinking and an attempt to understand this unfolding pandemic. The first thing is what it teaches us about globalization as a process of flows and paradoxically as well, closures. Quite rapidly, COVID has established itself as able to challenge the most globalized phenomenon we are familiar with, capitalism. It almost seems to be humbling. Capitalism at the game of moving around the globe and taking advantage of the situations the world offers. But that is where I think the idea of COVID-19 as a global pandemic seems to reflect the idea of unhindered globalization, because no sooner does it penetrate borders than it suddenly re-actualizes the hierarchies that and inequalities that are already present. So if there's one thing that we could learn from from COVID-19 as in terms of globalization, it is the ease with which it seems to defy the natural tendency in states to police borders, to detect and to detain, and in many regards, as we know, with other attempts to cross borders, to deport. So there is something here that those who would want a new approach to define the logic of policing, the logic of containment, could learn from COVID, is how to cross borders undetected and how to affirm oneself by bypassing the initial attempts to control. So that's an aspect I would like us to reflect on further. The second one is what COVID suggests to us could be interesting new ways of connectivity that we can take on board seriously, not just as a stopgap measure, but as a permanent composite, a permanent complement of more face-to-face conventional ways of connecting and relating to one another. And this is very important for universities, for example, where we have had a conventional approach to teaching that requires being present in lecture halls in a face-to-face manner. And now with COVID-19, we have been forced to work remotely. And it's an aspect of being that has always been with us, only it never really seriously considered as a way of doing things in a more or less stable and consistent manner. So COVID seems to suggest that going forward, what we can only experience maybe through more remote senses, like behind a computer, as we're doing now with this particular webinar, we may try to blend the two for future planning and strategic revisions of our sense of the normal in knowledge production and in conferencing and in sharing, as we have the habit and the mission to do. The third thing which COVID has suggested that perhaps we need to scrutinize further is the idea of how to offer effective leadership. Since COVID, we've had the opportunity of seeing leaders at various levels of intervention in action. And in this way, some have fared better than others. The literature is abundant. There have been the case has been made that male leaders, for example, have been in many many instances disappointing, diversionary in their approach to these things, and whereas in countries led by women, there have been some inspiration that could be drawn upon. But again, what this suggests, perhaps, is not necessarily that we should proceed with these lessons in terms of seeking to substitute men with women, but to see again the idea of complementarity, that leadership that is effective does not need to come in zero-sum terms, but rather in conversation with the different attributes that each and every one can offer, whether by virtue of their gender, the location, the race, the ethnicity, and so on and so forth. So the conversation that is generous to the attributes that make us effective is needed in terms of imagining a much more productive form of leadership that we could use to respond more effectively to COVID. One thing it's also taught us in this regard is the very idea of power. That if we care to scrutinize power closely, we notice that power hates to be confined. Power is very uncomfortable with being hemmed in. It likes the possibility to move around and distribute itself meaningfully to be more productive. The tendency to concentrate power and in predictable places or in predictable spaces needs rethinking. And I think that is something that COVID has taught us. Above all, we, even as COVID has proved itself to cross borders without effort and to affect almost every aspect of society, neutralizing geographies of development and so on. We have, it has also pointed to the resilience of systemic inequalities and hierarchies. Whether we're dealing with North America, the US in particular, or England, or Britain, or South Africa, or anywhere, there is a sense in which the hierarchies of inequalities and so on seems to have been reproduced rather than questioned by COVID as a homogenizing pandemic. So what that comes back to the point that Howard made earlier, that when COVID strikes, or when a pandemic or an epidemic strikes, it tends to open our eyes up to reveal things that are already there, but that simply we didn't focus enough on them. So this resilience of inequalities and the hierarchies is something that COVID has simply compounded, or at least made us more aware of them than we were initially. Fourth, it's good to focus also on Africa's COVID, what I call Africa's COVID predicament. And Africa's COVID predicament presents itself in my estimation, at least three levels. The first is that increasingly, as soon as COVID caught on to various societies, it became evident that it was people are even though Africa's cases have been relatively low in relation to the rest of the world, there's also the risk that Africans might end up dying, not necessarily of COVID, but of, say, hunger, and of conditions that have been there before COVID, and the emergency of COVID have simply taken attention away from them, such as TB and other health hazards. So our attention and focus on COVID may mitigate COVID, and in quite if the reports on Africa are to be believed, Africa is doing quite well in terms of COVID numbers, but hunger is a real challenge. And I remember vividly reading about a mother of with I think about 5 children or so in Kenya, who had to for lack of food took upon herself to cook stones for her children to have the impression that food was being prepared for them, and her hope was that they would fall asleep while waiting for food. And that's how dire the situation can be in some instances. In other instances, while some of us have retreated and can comfortably work remotely, others whose very livelihoods depend on working outdoors and moving about, can't afford the same privileges, and they lose their jobs. And if they have the jobs, they stand run a greater risk of being affected by COVID. The second predicament that I dwell on is the risk that Africa becomes a victim of perennial racism and neocolonialism. And if you've been following the debate since the outbreak of COVID, every now and again, something has surfaced to that effect. It's the case of Madagascar coming up with a solution which it thought could help against COVID, but immediately being confronted with skepticism and to the point where it almost seems, or it made some people on the continent to think that solutions are only solutions if they are developed outside of the continent. So the challenge in this case is how to take the continent and its attempts at coming up with solutions to the predicament seriously, while not closing the doors on initiatives that are developed from outside the continent. Again, here a conversation is needed between endogenous African attempts at coping with these challenges and initiatives from elsewhere. The third predicament is coping with attendant economic downturns and recessions. What COVID has done is almost everywhere it has affected economies. In fact, with the exception of the big tech companies, almost everyone would claim that COVID has been devastating to businesses. And relatively speaking, the continent is quite reliant on partnerships or aid or resources from elsewhere, say Europe and North America. But since the COVID experience is global, it actually means that resources which initially might have been directed at African initiatives are going to be reprioritized to deal with situations in the various nation states. Since we have been rather very unimaginative in our approach to the challenge of COVID, we have resorted we've relied overly on the nation state and at best regional bodies for solving a global pandemic instead of imagining new, innovative, creative and innovative ways or solidarities. And that is a serious concern. My final point is the very challenge of resilient COVID. Although we've been with it since the beginning of the year, we're still learning, coming to understand the COVID, and we don't quite know much about it. Those who have recovered from it share the accounts, and the accounts are that to recover from COVID in the short term is not the whole story. That there are complications that remain with you and side effects that we are yet to fathom very well. I think one such account that I read in putting down my thoughts was that of the CNN travel reporter Richard Quest, who was telling us about effects to the point of his antibodies behaving in a way that is not the way he was used to, and so on and so forth. And many of such accounts have filtered through to suggest that we still have to provide space to understanding what we still don't know about the effects of COVID, and that COVID might be with us for a long time to come. So to conclude, I would like to suggest a way forward in terms of imagining innovative modes of solidarity. We should not fall back on the conventional institutions or conventional logics of dealing with a global challenge. The current institutions, not even the WHO that comes closest to bringing the whole world around this crisis, may have all the answers or satisfactory answers, especially in a context where some nation states are pulling out and pulling resources from it. So we need to go back to the drawing board and be creative in our quest for new modes of solidarity. And one such example I would mention just in past is something that was reported in Business Insider on March 5th here in South Africa, of when Italy was overwhelmed by COVID cases and had asked fellow European countries to come to its assistance, but these countries had prioritized their own nationals. South Africa was the country that sent 800,000 masks to Italy. Now, that was a very unlikely source for Italy to turn to in a context of where the normal first port of call is the EU. And here is South Africa giving assistance to Italy, but that opens up the possibility of for the sort of things that I'm trying to suggest here, new modes of solidarity rather than simply going back to familiar avenues of intervention. The second is that COVID suggests that we need to revisit the idea of Ubuntu, not in a derogatory manner, but as a possible philosophy of incompleteness. And by that I mean that the template of the world in which we are called upon to act and to be relevant is a world that believes in this zero-sum pretension that superiority is possible and attainable and that completeness is an ideal. But the more we scrutinize, the more of a fallacy that is. And the sooner we recognize that incompleteness is the norm and that interdependence is what we all do, and because we live in an interconnected world. Only then can we provide for this sort of a model of collaboration that treats us and relates to us as through the richness of the compositeness of our being, thanks to the interconnections that we all share, and that in a context where we are composites and where we are incomplete, the normal way of planning and the normal way of policy is about trying to maximize convivial forms of relating and of seeking to cope with the challenges that we face. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prof. Nyamjo. I was wondering whether you would finish your presentation without mentioning the word convivial. And I waited and waited, and eventually you did mention the word convivial, which is a word that I have come to associate with yourself for this illuminating presentation. I want us to move quickly now to the discussion session. And I have a few questions that I have jotted down just listening to all the speakers, but I believe that other participants in the webinar are also being invited to send in their questions electronically. And so when those come, I will try and highlight them. Now, Professor Phillips, it was fascinating listening to you and the 5 basic ways in which we respond to pandemics, or what pandemics causes us to do, societies to do. And listening to you, I wondered whether you thought that in the way South Africa, for example, has responded to COVID-19, are you satisfied that South Africa responded like a country that has learnt its lessons from the plague, from the Spanish flu, from polio, from HIV and AIDS? Do you think that we were bringing our lessons into our response to COVID-19, or were we caught napping? I would like to hear what you think about that. And then to Professor Veil, it was fascinating listening to you and calling us all immigrants now. Should I just stick to one question for now? And then we'll, okay, all right. Let me stop before I ask Professor Veil, and then maybe Professor Phillips would love to say a little bit more to the question that I asked him.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm not sure that current decision makers have actually been aware of the lessons from the past. I think often they've taken their lead from what has been suggested or laid down by the WHO. And my contention is that if they had been aware of South Africa's pandemic past, they would have been able to anticipate many of the features and act in anticipation rather than after the event. I think one of the marked features of the South African response is the general ignorance of the pandemic past and the lessons to be learned. And consequently, my sense is that there could have been much more preemptive action rather than action after the event. I think that pertains in medical, in public health, but also in how one responds to fear, how one responds to the threats of economic disruption. And so my overall response to your question is, I don't think that they've learned the lessons of the past. They've had to discover them anew, afresh. And that does seem to me to be a very ineffective way of dealing with the present when the lessons from the past are there. Let me raise just one further question, and that is, why do you think the lessons of the past have not been learned, have not been even aware of? I think that there are points here about in many ways, the education of South Africans and beyond in terms of the nature of their past and what the past has to teach them. I think we might put a light on the shortcomings of our educational systems in terms of what is regarded as important, and certainly pandemics have not been regarded as important part of our past, and I think we've paid the lesson for that.
What a pity. I mean, from your presentation, it is very clear that pandemics have shaped quite fundamentally who we are and who we have become. And so to neglect them is quite a calamity. And thank you very much. I'd like to move to the question that I was framing for Professor Veil. My China, you were talking about us being immigrants. And I got a picture of a pandemic that has been global and that has disrupted and caused lack of stability in every country, in every society, in the way we think and the way we view the world. But the truth is, some countries seem to have responded better than others. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand will say that she did better than Trump. What is the difference then? If this is indeed was an international global epidemic, what accounts for what looks like better responses? Or are these surface better responses when at a deeper level we have all been struck and caused to be unstable and immigrant and all the things that you were saying? Prof. Veil?
Thank you very much. Perhaps, Mr. Chairman, we should explain to our colleagues here that we have this association through China because the two of us were on a trip to China some years ago. And we found kindred souls during that trip, hence this internal joke about my China. Can I come to that question, but just put something on top of what Howard said? I mean, the test surely for the planet is if we can all have a playbook, if we can develop a playbook out of COVID about how to deal internationally, cross borders, with all the issues Francis and others have raised about how to deal with pandemics. Now, the question is, where is that done? Just as a little footnote, I mean, the American Department of National Intelligence in 2004 put a playbook together on how to deal with pandemics in the United States. And that remains a document, apparently, which still has veracity, which still has information. The problem is that the president didn't reach out for it. So the issue is, can we create a playbook, which is an international playbook with which to deal with it? I think different countries have responded in different ways. Although there have been cultural differences, the culture of politics and the culture of ethnicity has been different. I think the New Zealand case is an exception. It's a small country. It has an island, which is easy to block off. It's a very homogeneous society, less so now than it was, but it's a very homogeneous society. I think the point that was made, Francis made, about women being in charge is a nice little point to make, but it's essentially a political point, not a point about political management, if you get the difference of what I'm saying. So I think, as they say, geography is destiny. And I think different countries have responded in different ways because they have had better health systems. They've been geographically better placed. They have people have been educated differently in terms of health. These are factors too. So I think there are too many cases here to make some generalizations about it. And I would respond to that question of migrants. I think we're all migrants because we have no playbook and no way and no stability and no secure units to understand this through.
Thank you very much, Professor Veil. That's a very helpful comment because there are all these platitudes. Sometimes one gets a kind of competition between countries. My country has done better than yours as far as COVID-19 is concerned. But I think the point you were making was that at a fundamental level, we are all faced with a new world, whether you are in New Zealand or you are in Germany or you are in the Congo because of COVID-19, and I appreciated that very much. Professor Tajo, you spoke about Ebola, and I really thought that was very instructive to focus on what has been and has become a peculiarly African pandemic, as you rightly pointed out, that it was blamed on Africa, as it were, and confined to Africa and described in those terms, belongs to the African past and so on. Now, it almost happened to China, the same thing with COVID-19. You could argue that the same thing happened to Spain with the Spanish, so-called Spanish influenza, 1918, where one country or one continent gets blamed, as Professor Phillips was saying. How has China, in your view, managed to escape the stigma better than Africa did with the stigma of Ebola? Because you were talking about uncertainty and you were talking about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. But China seems to be faring better. It's not called the Chinese flu, even though President Trump tried. But we didn't manage to escape Ebola at becoming our problem. How did that come about?
Well, thanks for the question, Prof. Maluleke. Look, it's a big question. It's a big question, but it's the stigma of Ebola that stuck to Africa and did so much damage psychologically is due to the fact that those trees, as I said earlier, were already in a very bad economic state when the epidemic struck, and therefore they were in a very vulnerable situation. And this and the epidemic brought everything to the fore. In the case of China, it's a global power. It's a huge economic power, and it has managed to contain the epidemic in a much more efficient way than as we see the United States or the United Kingdom or even France, because also it was better prepared with SARS, as you remember. So from their lessons, I think a bit faster. But I think that unfortunately for the African continent, we have this heart of darkness kind of perception that is difficult to get rid of, and this is something we have to be aware of, and we have to find a new way of a new image, new representations for the continent. I think that's our biggest challenge. Not only because I'm talking about the way the world views us, but also for ourselves, so that we have a more constructive way of dealing with our challenges.
Thank you very much, Prof. For that answer. It's very helpful. As a theologian, perhaps I should say, thank God COVID-19 did not emerge from Africa, because who knows what would have happened. We might have become the source of all the pandemics in the world. That might have been the perception. Professor Nyamjo, before I go to the question that we have received from one of the people attending the webinar, you were talking about resilience. At some stage, I thought you were almost mocking the resilience of ordinary people, but I don't think that's what you were doing. The question I want to ask you is, so you've got two sets of resiliences. You've got the resilience of ordinary people, popular resilience, and the resilience of inequality, colonialism, globalization, imperialism, all of that. What will it take for the resilience of ordinary people, especially in the face of a pandemic, to trump the resilience of globalization and inequality?
I think that's a very good question. I would say that ordinary people are often invited to demonstrate the capacity to withstand the whims and caprices of structural forces in their lives. really, or in this case, often natural disasters, but basically it's around structural forces. So if you cannot make ends meet, you don't look and scrutinize the forces that shape relations in society and produce certain powerlessness in a way. So the challenge, far from mocking that resilience, I am increasingly drawing attention to what is actually happening, and maybe challenging us to begin to put the building blocks together towards questioning taken for granted pockets or locations of power, and to understand that actually when power is predictably located, it is actually being suffocated. It is suffering and screaming and claiming to be liberated so it can fulfill itself meaningfully. Power does not have the habit of being confined. Those who confine it, capture it, they give the impression that those are the normal places to look for power. So it would take the ordinary people beginning to understand that we need to free up power in order to make it more accessible, to make it fulfill itself through its spread in ways that are unpredictable and more productive. I think that's what I would say.
So power without centers, in many centers, as it were, so that you have less and less margins. I think that's a brilliant answer to this. We received one question. I'm not sure if Prof. Ogude, you would want to come in, but let me read that question. That question says, pandemics from the past have shaped who we are, clearly. And I think all the panelists agree with that. What do the panelists think the impact of COVID-19 will be on young children in the future? This question is directed to no particular panelist, so anyone should feel free to speak to it.
Yeah, let me raise a few questions, and I'll direct them to various panelists. The first question will go to Professor Phillips. Professor Phillips, let me just thank you for what I thought was, a brilliant take on the history of pandemics. I personally learned a lot. But I want to take you back to something that you raised, and that is that pandemics often surface, or they tend to surface, the rotten underbelly of the human condition. A process through which you find there's a lot of finger pointing and looking for scapegoats. It is not us, it is them. Why is this so? Why is it that it surfaces these human subjectivities and specifically the rotten underbelly of our societies? To Professor Peter Vale, you made a very important point, in fact, 3 important points. One, you talked about the tension between the state and the so-called individual freedom, the tension between community and individualism, the city of yes and the city of no. I'm curious, really, to understand. I want you to linger, to comment more on this. Yeah.
No, just finish that one.
Yeah, how do we grapple with, the tyranny of individualism, much as we want also to grapple with the tyranny of English that you are talking about as we search for a language, a lexicon that we can use to frame, the pandemic, the pandemic that we are facing. And to Professor Tajo, you mentioned that the people are key to containing the pandemic. I want you to linger on this again by drawing our attention to some of the lessons that we learned from Ebola with respect to this pandemic, especially the lessons that are embedded in the lives of people. Professor Nyamjo, again, thank you for very fascinating talk. One thing that I wanted you to linger on to, how do we harness local indigenous initiatives when it comes to dealing with the pandemic? The tendency is for us to police the people instead of attempting to harness their initiatives in response, to some of the problems that are confronting us. How do you reflect on this? I know that you mentioned at a theoretical level some of the lessons that we can learn from the philosophy of Ubuntu, for example, and the way it draws our attention, to the incompleteness, of ourselves, our vulnerabilities and interdependence, as human beings. Can you linger more? I'm interested in some of these local initiatives that could be exploited in grappling with the pandemic. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. These are very brilliant questions. I believe we have less than 10 minutes left, so I'd like to give the panelists the opportunity to respond to your questions and encourage them to share the 8 minutes between themselves.
Thanks, Professor Good. I think the short answer to your question is that epidemics surface what you call the rotten underbelly, because what epidemics do is provide fears, generate fears about our most basic element, and that is life. They are very simply threats to life. The threat of death is what immediately mobilizes human response. And this is in all societies at all times, whether we're talking about Moses or Muhammad or the Mahatma or the Mandelas or Merkel. All of them are human beings with a fear of death. And so if you provide a huge threat to life, that fear of death, which is what epidemics essentially do, they elicit the most basic responses. And those responses show up what you call the rotten underbelly of society. I think what you need to bear in mind is that epidemics do not necessarily create abnormalities. What they do is show up the abnormalities already within society and show them up in very stark forms indeed. And that's, I think, why the ugly side of society, the underlying attitudes which perhaps are veneered over under so-called normal circumstances, show up so starkly. So my simple answer to you is epidemics threaten fundamentally our life. And so they elicit the most primordial responses. And these show up the underpinnings of society very, very dramatically indeed. Thanks.
Professor Wade?
Tackle these things very quickly. Firstly, on the impact on children, clearly it will have an individual impact on individual children. And I think this is a negotiation between the parent, the society, the school eventually, to try and understand the traumatization of a child who's been through this, born into this terrible fear and continuing this terrible fear. On this question, I just want to say in a general sense, I think the work of historians of medical crises like Howard and medical anthropologists and everyone is opening up our understanding of this important issue, the link between health and society over time and in immediate circumstances. So I think things are very different now than they were 30 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. To respond to James's point, I mean, the tyranny of individualism and the tyranny of English. I think that what the pandemic has shown us is that neoliberal economics is fundamentally flawed. And neoliberal economics has carried the banner of individualism in fundamental ways. Now, of course, we know that the big tech companies are getting richer and richer, and individuals are getting richer and richer, but becoming much more aware of this and aware of the importance. And we now understand that economics is not the great sort of elixir to solve all society's problems, and that's tied up in the climate issue too. On the tyranny of English, I think we have to continuously talk about its tyranny. We have to talk about the structure of the language, the way it's become such a tool of globalization and indeed benefited from globalization. So we have to teach many languages and celebrate many languages and be very critical of English because it is a tyranny and a stronger tyranny. I mean, the relationship between neoliberalism and English is undeniable. And I think that also has to be teased out. So let's return to Neville Alexander. English is not neutral.
Very much, Peter. Professor Tajo?
Yes, I think that we have to. When I say that people are the key to the problem, to the solution, is that we have to take into account and respect cultural practices and beliefs to a certain extent. We have to find a negotiating ground. And if I take the example of traditional practitioners, it's clear that there needs to be a stronger cooperation between modern or Western medicine and traditional medicine for the simple reason that most of the population in Africa is still very much in touch with traditional medicine. Because it's closer to their reality, it's more affordable, and there is more trust. So it's important to understand the setting, the cultural setting, and then work on it for a better collaboration. And then I think that health education in schools, to respond to the question about children, is important. I think we should completely look at the what is taught to young people and see that we have to adapt that knowledge to the present situation, and also work on the mind in the sense that having a better perception of ourselves, give young children an idea of self-empowerment and a sense of innovation. And I would say that if we can have more South-South collaboration, it would be for the better. And if we can empower research in that sense, we can find a way out and a better situation.
Thank you so much, Prof. Professor Nyamjo, the last word.
Yeah, a very quick answer. The children of the future, as we all hope they survive, they will be far more composite in their relationship to reality, that they would easily understand the complementarity between offline and online, thanks in particular to the instruction that COVID has brought to bear. And to James' question about harnessing indigenous initiatives, it is very important to harness them, but we should not approach them with an overbearing know-all attitude. If we provide for conversations with these endogenous ways of knowing as complementary epistemologies, it could be very helpful to the academy. And just as science is not the outcome of a once-off experiment, but constant, rigorous, methodic interventions, where often 95% of the time you fail, and then 5% is the success that you show as science. So too should we learn to accommodate and not dismiss a priori anything that is named or labeled and presented as indigenous African ways of being and knowing and relating to pandemics or any other aspect of life. Thank you.
Well, that's how we come to the end of this session, the very first session of our scholarly reflections on the scientific and scholarly impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. I would like to thank Professor Howard Phillips for reminding us that every lesson we need to deal with the next pandemic we already have from history, if only we could learn and listen carefully. And Professor Peter Veil for painting a picture of the new world that is being born before us because of COVID-19, and the very expressive way in which you painted that world. Professor Tajo, thank you for speaking to us from the point of view of our own best experiences, benchmark experiences as Africans, focusing in particular on the lessons learned from Ebola and how we could do better as Africans using our own knowledges, as it were. Professor Nyamjo, I am very thankful for the manner in which you reminded us not to be romantic about notions of resilience, and to also be awake to many of the ways in which power gets locked up and privatized and colonized and recolonized, especially at times of pandemics such as this. Thank you for all of you for giving us very, very illuminating and very fascinating presentations. I would like to remind everyone that the next session is coming up at 2 o'clock. It will be as dynamic, and I invite everyone to come back for more. Thank you very much indeed.